This sample will be for the plain seam with a clean finished edge. Excuse me. For this sample, you will need to cut 2 of these long rectangles. We'll be using this particular rectangle as a pattern piece for quite a few samples moving forward. So for each sample you cut with this one, you'll need 2 rectangles so that you have 2 pieces of fabric to stitch together. When you cut, you will need to cut 1 long edge with your straight shears. That will be the edge that you will be sewing on, and then the other 3 edges will be pinked with your pinking shears to make sure that they don't ravel in your notebook. As you can see on my 2 rectangles, I've got 2 straight edges that are facing each other. Those will be the 2 edges that we are sewing together. Okay, to begin a regular plain seam, you're going to take your 2 pieces of fabric and put them right sides together. So that means the 2 printed sides should be touching each other. And I'm going to match up that straight edge that we just spoke about. Top and bottom of my rectangle should be even with each other. The entire straight edge should be even. And then I'm going to pin it. For this pinning, it is most efficient if you pin it going perpendicular to the edge that you're trying to sew. So if I'm going to sew down this edge, I'm going to take my pins and put them in the opposite direction. As I sew, that'll allow my foot to get as close to the pin as possible, holding those rectangles together as long as possible before I have to take out my pin. Okay, so pin those 2 together. And then I'm going to use the measurements on my machine to measure out a 1/2 inch seam allowance. A standard plain seam is 1/2 inch from the straight edge. So as I line up my fabric, my plate has etchings that will tell me the distance from the needle that I'm about to sew. I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric with that 1/2 inch etch mark. I should still see the 1/2 visible. And then I'm going to line up my needle with the very top edge of my sample. Start with my back stitch as short as possible. And then I'm going to watch that edge of my fabric and keep it in line with that marking on my machine to make sure that my 1/2 inch seam allowance stays consistent. Back stitch at the end to finish off your threads. And this is what a basic 1/2 inch seam allowance looks like. We will now finish the raw edges of our seam allowances. We don't ever want to leave completely raw edges on the inside of a garment. The first time that you launder it, those will begin to ravel and your garment will begin to fall apart. So the first thing we're going to do is press, and then we're going to come back and do a clean finished edge on this sample. So I have a little portable ironing board over here for the purposes of these videos. If you want to make one of these at home, they're really nice to keep in a dorm, an area where you don't have a lot of room for an ironing board. It's basically a piece of plywood wrapped in batting, and it's just stapled to the back of the plywood. So you first wrap it in some batting so that it has some cushion, some give to it. Make sure that your batting that you're using can withstand higher temperatures. You don't want it to start to melt on you when you put an iron on there. And then over that, I've got probably at least 2 layers of muslin or a basic cotton fabric. Muslin is the best because it doesn't have any color that will potentially bleed onto your samples. So we've stretched some muslin over there and then also stapled that to the back. So you can make one of these at home and it'll be easy for you to keep for your samples. Okay, the first thing we always want to do with our seam is bust open the seam allowances. So I'm going to lay my fabric flat, open it up, lay it flat on my ironing board, and then I'm going to open up those 2 seam allowances to spread them apart. I want this to be completely flat on front and back. I don't need any pleats where they don't belong. So make sure that you pull those apart as you're pressing so that you don't get any pleats down your seam on the other side. Now on my iron, make sure that you've got it set to the proper settings. On this particular one for cotton, it says it needs to be a level 6, so I've got my dial turned to level 6 over here. I don't want to accidentally burn or melt any of my fabric, so always check the temperature of your iron. Next thing we need to do is protect our sample from the iron. These tend to get dirty very quickly, especially with a lot of students using them. So we always want to make sure that we don't transfer any grime onto our sample. Set in your pressing cloth. On top of that, this is cheesecloth. You're also welcome to use muslin. And then press that. Now a press is different from an iron. An iron, typically you're just rubbing it over the surface of the garment to get out wrinkles. In this case, you're trying to set in a permanent crease. So I'm going to let it sit there for a minute. Set in that crease so that it is busted open. The next thing we're going to do is our clean finished edge. I'm going to single out one of my seam allowances. So all of the other layers are out of the way, and I've just got one seam allowance sticking off the edge. Lay that face down so that I'm only looking at the wrong side of my fabric. And then I'm going to fold back that raw edge about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, depending on the thickness of your fabric. In our case, I'm going to go ahead and do 1/4 of an inch. You'll need a ruler. I have a seam gauge here. This one has a movable little plastic piece on it. You can move it to the measurement that you're trying to do. These little wings on either side keep that measurement for you so that you can consistently use the same measurement. You can also just use a ruler if you don't have one of these. So I'm going to consistently measure 1/4 inch and press it. So do small sections at a time so that you can continue to measure. I like to kind of press it down with my fingernails. It puts a temporary crease in there that helps it stay still long enough for me to get the iron on top. Okay, so this is what it's currently looking like. I've got that raw edge folded over 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to open up my sample and take that other seam allowance that we haven't messed with yet, single that one out, and do the same thing. Consistency is very important when you're doing apparel construction and apparel design. The more consistent you are, the more consistent your sizes will be of your garments. If you say that something should be stitched at 1/2 of an inch, that should be true on all garments, a consistent 1/2 inch. That width should not change between garments or even within a single garment, because you will change the size of your final garment. Adding a little bit of fabric, will make it bigger. Subtracting a little bit of fabric will make it a smaller size. So consistency is very important. So in these, I'm going to make sure that each of those sides are finished at 1/4 inch. We started with 1/2 an inch, folded back 1/4, so we should still have 1/4 inch left visible on the inside of our garment. So this is what we're looking like right now with it open. Each of those sides has that raw edge folded back to where we can't see it anymore. now that we have each of our edges folded back on that seam allowance, I'm going to single out one of my seam allowances again, just like we did when we were ironing. But this time I'm going to look at the right side of the fabric, and I'm going to do an edge stitch. An edge stitch goes right along that folded edge as close to the edge as possible. And that's going to secure down that fold, that crease that we just pressed into our fabric, so that it doesn't come undone on the inside of the garment. Okay, so again, single out one side of your seam allowance. I should only be stitching on that. All of the other layers should be out of the way. And then I'm going to stitch as close to that edge as possible. On your foot, there isn't an etching to show you where an edge stitch should be. So I usually put it towards the inside edge of that right hand toe. That's as close to the needle as we can get. Start with your back stitch. And then you're going to follow along that edge, keeping it a consistent distance from the folded edge. Back stitch at the end. And that is one side done. Now I need to do the other side. So single out that other side by itself and repeat the same steps on that side. Again, line it up with that inside edge of my toe. And stitch right along the edge of the fabric. Okay, so this is what we're looking like on both sides. Last step on this sample is to give it a good press. After you've done all that stitching, your seam allowances will want to pop up off the surface. So now we're going to lay it face down. Seam allowances are busted open, so everything is separated. Using my press cloth to protect my sample, I'll give it one last press so it lays nice and flat in my notebook. And then I'm ready to turn this in. When I put this in my notebook, I want this side to be showing on the outside. So this face up. This is the inside of your garment, but this is where all the work is, and those are the areas that I'm going to be grading, making sure that your edge stitch is close enough to the edge of your fabric, that it's a consistent distance from your fabric, from the edge of your fabric, and that your seam allowances are each folded down to 1/4 inch. From the front, it should just look like a basic seam. No additional stitching or anything showing. Okay, so put this in your notebook. Just a single piece of tape at the top edge, rolled and put on the back, so not visible from the front. Roll a piece of tape, or you can use double-sided tape to stick just that top edge. And that way, when I'm grading your notebook, I can flip it up and down and see both sides.